I always believed I was an exceptional survivor. For 20 years, I swallowed my parents' philosophy that my relentless deprivation was simply forging my character. I actually smiled through those starving nights, convinced I was climbing the peak of success entirely barefoot. But it turned out that summit was a complete lie, and my bare feet were just bleeding on the shattered glass my own family had intentionally scattered across my path. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Haley Revenge Stories. Sadly, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the necessary budget to keep our operations running. If you find yourself captivated by today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1, so our dedicated team can afford their living expenses and continue bringing these stories to life. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or comments below. My name is Clara Morales. I am 24 years old, and tonight was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my life. I had just graduated with absolute top honors from the incredibly prestigious Northlight Academy. To celebrate, we were seated in the private dining room of the most exclusive restaurant in the city. The air smelled of aged oak and roasted truffles. Above us, a massive crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the pristine white tablecloths. Waiters in immaculate black suits glided around us, silently refilling our water glasses and clearing away plates of untouched artisan appetizers. The gentle clinking of crystal wine glasses echoed elegantly through the room. To anyone looking in, it was the perfect picture of a successful, loving family celebrating their brilliant daughter. But to me, that musical clinking of glass was nothing more than the background soundtrack to an agonizing performance of hypocrisy. Seated at the head of the table was my father, Richard. He looked every bit the distinguished gentleman in his tailored navy suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. He held up his glass of expensive red wine, gesturing toward me with a wide theatrical smile. "Look at this girl," my father boomed his voice, carrying just loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Graduating at the very top of her class from Northlight, and she did it all on her own. Pure grit and self-reliance. That is exactly how we raised her. We did not spoon-feed her a single thing. We taught her the value of hard work, and look at the diamond we produced." He raised his glass higher, practically begging for validation from the extended family members sitting around us, treating my agonizing 4 years of literal survival as his own personal parenting trophy. He wore his fictional sacrifice like a glittering badge of honor. Next to him sat my mother, Elaine. She wore a stunning emerald green silk dress and a practiced, serene smile that never quite reached her cold eyes. She reached out lightly, touching my father's arm with her perfectly manicured fingers, before adding her own perfectly crafted lines to the performance. "It is so incredibly true, Richard," my mother said, her tone dripping with a honeyed elegance that perfectly masked the absolute freezing indifference beneath it. "We could have made it so easy for her. We could have paid for everything. But what kind of parents would we be if we just handed her the world on a silver platter? We had to give her the gift of struggle. It was entirely for her own good. That is exactly how you teach real character and weed out weakness." I sat there staring at the perfectly seared filet mignon on my gold-rimmed plate, completely unable to stomach a single bite. The gift of struggle. That was the beautiful, flowery phrase my mother used to justify her complete emotional and financial abandonment. It was her favorite script, rehearsed and perfected over the years, to ensure no one ever questioned their parenting. The only authentic presence at that table was my grandmother, Eleanor. She sat quietly near the corner, her frail hands resting politely on her lap. She did not join in their self-congratulatory toasts. Instead, she just watched. Her sharp, intelligent eyes darted from my father's boasting face to my mother's fake smile, and finally to my exhausted posture. She was the only person in this entire family I genuinely trusted, the only one who ever looked at me with actual warmth, instead of viewing me as a convenient prop for their social standing. As my parents continued to narrate their fictional version of my upbringing to the nodding relatives around the table, my mind involuntarily drifted back to the reality of my college years. They were toasting to my character, but they did not know what that character actually smelled like. It smelled like the stale, burning grease of the late-night fast food joint where I worked from 8 in the evening until 2 in the morning. It smelled like the heavy, suffocating industrial bleach I used as a part-time janitor scrubbing the massive campus library floors and cleaning the public restrooms before the sun even thought about coming up. While my peers were forming study groups in cozy cafes and enjoying weekend campus parties, I was shivering in a tiny, uninsulated dorm room on the edge of campus. I vividly remembered wrapping myself in 3 layers of cheap, threadbare sweaters and wearing my winter coat indoors just to study because I could not afford the electricity bill to turn on a tiny space heater. I remembered the agonizing hollow ache in my stomach, surviving on plain instant noodles, and stealing free saltine crackers from the campus cafeteria for 5 straight days just to have something to chew on. I was practically a ghost walking the halls exhausted to my very bones, haunted by the constant terror of not being able to pay my next tuition installment or being evicted out onto the street. I had survived all of that. I had pulled myself out of the dirt entirely convinced that this brutal trial by fire was a normal part of becoming a resilient adult. I had foolishly accepted their narrative. But the truth hiding just beneath the surface of this luxurious, deceitful dinner was something far more sinister. Every extra shift I took, every meal I skipped, and every shivering night I spent studying in the dark was not designed to make me stronger. It was not a tough love parenting strategy. It was the direct, calculated result of a systematic plan to strip me of everything I had orchestrated flawlessly by the 2 people smiling at me from across the table. My father was just about to signal the waiter for another bottle of his ridiculously expensive vintage wine. He had his hand raised, his chest puffed out in that familiar pose of supreme self-satisfaction. The rest of the table was still murmuring their polite agreements, entirely captivated by the grand illusion my parents had so carefully constructed. Then my grandmother leaned forward. The gentle rustle of her cardigan seemed unnaturally loud in my ears. She offered me a warm, deeply affectionate smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners with genuine pride. She reached out her frail hand, gently patting the pristine white tablecloth. "I am so very glad that the $2,000 I sent every single month helped you get by, Clara," my grandmother said. Her voice was soft, laced with nothing but tender grandmotherly love. "I worried about you so much out there all on your own. But knowing you had that little financial cushion gave my heart such peace." The entire universe stopped spinning. The ambient, sophisticated hum of the private dining room suddenly vanished, sucked out into a complete, suffocating vacuum. The soft jazz playing through the hidden speakers faded into a muted, distorted buzz. At the table next to us, a waiter dropped a handful of silverware into a bus tub, and the crashing metal hit my eardrums like shattering glass. It was a piercing, violent noise that perfectly mirrored the violent rupture of my reality. A physical shockwave tore through my body. The familiar hollow emptiness in my stomach instantly solidified into a heavy block of ice. A freezing, jagged chill violently shot down the center of my spine, paralyzing my limbs. My lungs entirely forgot how to draw in oxygen. $2,000 a month. The words echoed in the hollow chambers of my mind, bouncing off the walls of my skull. $2,000. Every single month. I slowly turned my gaze away from my grandmother and looked directly across the table. The transformation of my parents was nothing short of cinematic. The boastful theatrical arrogance radiating from my father evaporated in a fraction of a second. His raised hand, still suspended in the air to call the waiter, began to tremble uncontrollably. The heavy silver dining fork slipped from his suddenly lifeless fingers, plummeting downward and striking his fine china plate with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence. His face drained of all its healthy wine, flushed color, leaving behind a sickening ashen gray. My mother was even worse. Her perfectly crafted, serene smile did not fade. Instead, it violently froze, twisting into a grotesque, paralyzed mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. Her eyes, previously so cold and composed, were now blown wide open in absolute terror. She looked exactly like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming freight train. She opened her mouth, her lips parting as if desperately trying to formulate a sentence, a defense, a lie, but her vocal cords completely refused to cooperate. Only a pathetic, strangled gasp escaped her throat. The extended family members who had just been loudly applauding my father's parenting skills were now entirely mute. They glanced nervously back and forth between my grandmother's innocent smile, my parents' sheer panic, and my terrifying stillness. The uncomfortable tension in the air was so thick, you could physically cut it with a steak knife. The silence that followed stretched out into an agonizing, suffocating eternity. It wrapped around our table like a heavy woolen blanket, choking the life out of the celebration. The truth, ugly and undeniable, lay completely naked under the warm golden glow of the chandelier. There were no shadows left for them to hide in. Any normal person would have screamed. Any other 24-year-old daughter, realizing the sheer magnitude of this betrayal, would have flipped the table, hurled her wineglass at the wall, and shrieked until her voice gave out. The betrayal demanded noise. It demanded a spectacular, chaotic breakdown. But I did not make a single sound. I did not shed a single tear. I sat perfectly, unnervingly still. My breathing leveled out into a slow, deliberate rhythm. I rested my forearms against the edge of the table, clasping my hands together, and simply stared directly into my mother's terrified eyes, and then shifted my gaze to my father's trembling jaw. I let the silence do the work. My absolute lack of reaction was a terrifying heavy weapon, and I pressed it firmly against their throats. I watched them squirm under the crushing weight of their own exposed guilt. In that frozen silent space, the math finally clicked perfectly into place inside my head. 4 entire years. 48 agonizing months of my life. My grandmother, the only person who truly cared, had been sending a massive financial lifeline meant entirely for me, but she had trusted them to deliver it. She had deposited that money into their accounts, believing their promises that they were securely passing it along to their struggling daughter. They had intercepted every single penny. While I was dragging heavy trash bags through the freezing campus courtyards at 2 a.m, they were quietly cashing a check meant to keep me safe. They had watched me wither away, physically exhausted and literally starving. They had listened to my desperate phone calls where I begged for a simple $20 loan just to buy used textbooks. They had listened to me cry from sheer exhaustion, and then they had hung up the phone and pocketed my $2,000. The revelation hit me not with explosive anger, but with an absolute deadly clarity. The memories that had always served as my badges of honor began to rot violently inside my mind. I was performing a brutal, unanesthetized surgery on my own past, slicing open every single moment of hardship and finding the toxic black tumor of financial abuse hiding underneath. I remembered one terribly freezing morning during my junior year. I had miraculously secured a final interview for a highly competitive career-making internship in a neighboring state. The round-trip bus ticket cost exactly $45. I had exactly $12 in my checking account. I called my parents, entirely swallowing my pride, crying into the receiver and begging for a tiny temporary loan so I could just get on that bus. My mother had sighed softly into the phone, her voice dripping with disappointed maternal wisdom. She told me that bailing me out would ruin my natural problem-solving skills, that the universe was testing my resolve. I missed the interview. I spent that entire day weeping in the silent aisles of the campus library. 3 days later, I saw the photos my father proudly posted online. They were smiling radiantly in front of a sprawling 5-star ski resort in Aspen, wearing brand-new designer snow gear, holding up crystal glasses filled with what were easily $100 cocktails. They were literally drinking my bus ticket. They were casually swallowing my future while praising my resilience. How had I never seen the strings? How had I never reached out to my grandmother or my aunts for a lifeline? The answer was just another layer of their brilliant sociopathic manipulation. Whenever I was on the absolute brink of total despair, they would feed me these beautifully packaged inspirational speeches. My father would firmly tell me that true champions suffer in silence, that the greatest leaders are built in the dark. My mother would gently warn me that complaining to the extended family would only make me look weak, pathetic, and ungrateful in their eyes. They had carefully built a psychological cage out of motivational quotes, expertly isolating me from anyone who might have accidentally uncovered their massive financial fraud. They made sure I was far too ashamed of my own poverty to ever speak a single word of it to the outside world. The violent, white-hot rage that had initially flared up in my chest began to rapidly cool, hardening into something infinitely more dangerous. I felt an absolute terrifying calmness wash over my entire nervous system. I knew with absolute chilling certainty that I could not afford the luxury of an emotional breakdown. If I started screaming, crying, or throwing accusations right here in the middle of this high-end restaurant, I would immediately lose the high ground. My parents were master manipulators. They would instantly pivot. They would gaslight me in front of the entire family. They would play the victims, claiming it was a terrible misunderstanding, or that they had put the money into a high-yield trust fund for my future wedding, confusing everyone with brilliant, fabricated financial jargon. If I confronted them now, armed with nothing but my raw feelings, they would simply talk their way out of the corner and make me look crazy. I needed a weapon forged from solid iron. I needed undeniable, documented mathematical proof. I briefly shifted my gaze to my older brother David, who was sitting 2 seats down. He had always been the golden child, the one who drove a brand new luxury sedan off the lot the day he turned 18. He never had to take out a single student loan or work a single minimum wage shift. Right now, David was shifting nervously in his plush leather chair, his face pale, suddenly completely unable to meet my eyes. I could see the agonizing gears turning in his head as he mentally recalculated his entire privileged existence. He was realizing in real time that his comfortable life, his debt-free degree, and the massive down payment on his beautiful suburban house might have been directly funded by my absolute starvation. He swallowed hard and stared down at his untouched dessert, paralyzed by cowardice. He was a passive beneficiary of their cruelty, and his guilty silence confirmed everything I needed to know. In that precise moment, the Clara who desperately craved her parents' love and validation permanently died. I completely and cleanly detached my emotions from the people sitting in front of me. I was no longer a traumatized daughter sitting at a celebratory dinner table. I was a clinical scientist, and I was about to begin a very meticulous, very punishing experiment. My mother and father were no longer my family. They were simply lab rats, scurrying blindly around in a maze of their own lies, entirely unaware that I had just locked all the doors and turned off the lights. At the restaurant, after that suffocating eternity of silence, my father had finally cleared his throat, sputtering out a nervous laugh that sounded exactly like a dying engine. "Oh, Mother, you must be getting confused," he had stammered frantically, wiping a thick bead of sweat from his forehead. That money went directly into a highly secure, high-yield trust fund for Clara. We simply did not want her to lose her incredible drive. My mother had quickly chimed in, her voice trembling slightly frantically, adding that it was just a massive misunderstanding regarding the withdrawal dates and bank policies. I let my face soften. I forced my tense muscles to relax, exhaled deeply, and gave them a hesitant, relieved nod. "A trust fund," I murmured, injecting just enough naive, desperate hope into my voice to make it believable. "I see. I just did not know." The visible wave of relief that immediately crashed over them was pathetic to witness. They bought my performance completely. They genuinely believed I was still the obedient, foolish daughter they had spent over 2 decades grooming. They let their guard down, and that was their fatal, unforgivable mistake. 2 weeks later, an opportunity presented itself perfectly. They were flying out for an exclusive weekend wine tasting tour in Napa Valley, a trip they claimed was a much-needed corporate networking retreat. They called and asked me to house sit and feed their purebred Persian cat. I agreed with a cheerful, dutiful smile. The very moment their sleek black luxury SUV pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street, the entire energy inside the massive 5-bedroom house violently shifted. The silence of the empty house was not peaceful. It was thick, heavy, and pregnant with hidden secrets. I stood in the grand marble foyer, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock, feeling the adrenaline pumping through my veins like ice water. I was no longer a daughter standing in her childhood home. I was a phantom operating in enemy territory. I walked straight past the pristine designer kitchen, completely ignoring the cat winding around my ankles, and headed directly up the curved oak staircase toward my father's home office. My father fancied himself a brilliant, untouchable businessman, but when it came to modern technology, he was embarrassingly illiterate. The heavy wooden door to his office was locked, but he always hid the spare brass key under the heavy paperweight on the hallway console. I let myself in. The room smelled of expensive imported cigars and polished mahogany. I sat down in his massive leather executive chair and woke up his desktop computer. I did not need to be a master hacker. His primary password was literally taped to the bottom of his keyboard on a faded yellow sticky note. It was simply his birth year followed by my mother's first name. A truly pathetic lock for a vault built entirely on devastating lies. I logged in, opened his internet browser, and navigated straight to his saved passwords menu. In less than 3 minutes, I had full, unrestricted access to their joint checking accounts, savings accounts, and a complex labyrinth of credit card statements dating back 4 entire years. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my hands remained perfectly unnervingly steady on the mouse. I started pulling up the monthly bank statements, meticulously cross-referencing the transaction dates with the exact times my grandmother made her deposits. There it was, month after month, year after year, a smooth, uninterrupted pipeline of cash flowing directly from my grandmother's pension into their bloated accounts. I pulled up a digital calculator and started adding up the lines, watching the numbers climb until they hit the final horrifying sum. $96,000. That was the exact price tag they had placed on my suffering. $96,000 meant for my survival swallowed whole. But seeing the total number was not the worst part. It was seeing precisely where every single cent went. I scrolled through the transaction history, watching the disgusting digital footprint of their extravagant lifestyle unfold on the glowing monitor. Thousands of dollars spent on imported Italian leather shoes, endless charges at luxury car dealerships for premium upgrades to their vehicles, ridiculous sums blown on exclusive country club memberships, and $2,000 dropped on a high-end espresso machine just for their kitchen counter. Then my eyes locked onto a specific sequence of dates from November of my sophomore year. I felt all the air violently leave my lungs. I remembered that specific November vividly. I had contracted a severe respiratory infection from working long shifts in the freezing rain. I was coughing up blood in my unheated dorm room, terrified to fall asleep. I had called my mother, practically wheezing into the phone, begging for a mere $50 to buy prescription antibiotics, because the campus clinic would not dispense them for free. She had told me to drink hot tea and sleep it off, claiming things were incredibly tight for them financially that month, and they could not spare a dime. I stared intently at the bank statement for that exact same week. There was a cleared charge for $3,500 at a 5-star oceanfront resort in Maui, immediately followed by an $800 dinner at a Michelin-starred seafood restaurant. They were drinking expensive champagne on a private sun-drenched beach, while my lungs were literally filling with fluid. A cold, dark, endless void opened up inside my chest, permanently swallowing any remaining trace of hesitation, guilt, or mercy I might have harbored for them. I went to work with the cold, meticulous precision of a seasoned investigator. I downloaded every single PDF bank statement, every credit card bill, and every single digital receipt I could find. I transferred the massive, damning file onto a secure external hard drive I had purchased with cash the day before. I then meticulously cleared the computer's temporary files, completely wiped the recent download history, and restored the browser tabs to the exact state I had found them in. I left absolutely no digital fingerprints, no shifted papers, and no trace whatsoever that a predator had been sitting at that desk. Over the next 3 days, hidden safely away in my own tiny apartment, I printed out every single document. I did not just stack the papers. I organized them with lethal calculated intent. I used neon-colored highlighters to connect my grandmother's monthly deposits directly to their outrageous luxury purchases. I built a comprehensive chronological and entirely undeniable timeline of their massive fraud. I placed everything into a heavy black leather binder securing the pages within clear plastic sleeves, complete with an alphabetized index. It was a masterpiece of financial forensics. It was not just a collection of printed papers. It was a fully loaded, devastating weapon perfectly calibrated and quietly waiting to be fired at the very center of their carefully constructed, arrogant world. 3 weeks after the initial restaurant disaster, I sent out elegant gold-embossed invitations for a private dinner at the Monarch, a venue even more exclusive than the last. I framed it as a family healing and gratitude dinner. To ensure the trap was inescapable, I extended the guest list far beyond our immediate relatives. I invited the president of their elite country club, my father's 2 biggest corporate investors, and the senior partners from my mother's real estate firm. These were the exact people they worshipped the incredibly wealthy audience they had spent decades performing for. My parents arrived practically glowing with arrogant confidence. They walked into the private banquet room hand in hand, beaming at their wealthy friends. They genuinely believed they had successfully navigated the crisis. They thought my invitation was a white flag, a naive daughter's pathetic attempt to apologize for the awkwardness of the graduation dinner and publicly validate their fabricated trust fund story. Throughout the first 2 courses of roasted duck and imported caviar, my father held court. He dominated the conversation, loudly boasting about his recent business acquisitions and dropping heavy strategic hints about the massive trust fund he had supposedly set up for me. My mother played her part flawlessly, nodding serenely and accepting glowing compliments on her stunning designer gown. They were entirely in their element, deeply intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. I sat quietly at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, sipping sparkling water and watching them gorge themselves on their own hubris. As the waiters silently cleared the main course plates and prepared to serve dessert, the ambient chatter in the room reached a comfortable, slightly wine-drunk hum. This was the exact peak of their comfort. It was time. I stood up. I did not tap my glass with a spoon. I did not ask for attention. I simply reached into the heavy leather tote bag resting beside my chair and pulled out the thick black leather binder. I dropped it directly onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed loudly, instantly cutting through the polite conversation. Every eye in the room turned toward me. My father chuckled a slick practice sound. "Ah, what is this, Clara?" my father asked, his tone dripping with patronizing amusement. "A presentation of your future career plans for our esteemed guests." I did not smile. I placed my hands flat on the table, leaned forward slightly, and looked directly into his eyes. "No," I said, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any emotion. "This is an accounting." I flipped open the heavy black cover. The first page was a blown-up high-resolution printout of my grandmother's signed bank statement, highlighting the exact date she initiated the monthly transfer of $2,000 4 years ago. I slid it down the table so it rested right in front of the country club president. For the past 48 months, my grandmother Eleanor generously deposited $2,000 every single month into a joint account managed by Richard and Elaine. I began, my voice projecting clearly to every corner of the silent room. The money was explicitly meant for my college living expenses. My parents claimed this money was placed into a secure trust fund for my future. My mother's serene smile violently twitched. She half rose from her chair, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table. "Clara, sweetheart, this is hardly the time or place for financial discussions. We have guests." I completely ignored her and turned to the second page. It was a dense spreadsheet, heavily color-coded in bright neon pink and yellow. "This is the comprehensive transaction history of that specific account cross-referenced with their personal credit cards." I continued sliding copies down the table to the corporate investors and the real estate partners. As you can clearly see highlighted in yellow, the exact sum of $2,000 was immediately transferred out of the so-called trust fund within 48 hours of every deposit. Highlighted in pink is where that money actually went. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp rustle of thick paper as the wealthy guests leaned in to examine the documents. You will notice a charge for $1,200 at a boutique jeweler exactly 1 day after my grandmother's deposit in March of my freshman year. That was the same week I was threatened with eviction from my off-campus housing, I stated, tapping the page with my index finger. I turned another page, my movements precise and mechanical. Here is a charge for $4,000 to a luxury car dealership in September of my junior year, the precise month I had to drop a crucial lab class because I could not afford the required textbook materials. "Stop this immediately," my father hissed. His face was rapidly draining of color, morphing into a sickly shade of gray. His voice was completely stripped of its usual booming authority. "You are deeply confused. These documents are entirely fabricated. You are embarrassing yourself." "Page 24, I countered, cutting him off with the sharpness of a scalpel. I pulled out the most damning piece of evidence. November, my sophomore year. A cleared payment of $3,500 to the Azure Ocean Resort in Maui, and an $800 charge at a Michelin-starred restaurant on the exact same island. Attached to that page are the printed text messages I sent my mother that exact week begging for $50 for prescription antibiotics because I was coughing up blood with a severe lung infection. Her response stating they were entirely broke and could not help me is time-stamped. The senior partner from my mother's real estate firm gasped audibly, dropping the paper back onto the table as if it were physically burning her fingers. She stared at my mother with a look of absolute, unshielded disgust. My mother began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved and she looked frantically around the room, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face. She found absolutely nothing but horror and revulsion. "It is not what it looks like," she stammered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "We needed that vacation. The stress of business was killing us. We were going to pay it all back, every single cent." She had just publicly confessed. The weak, disjointed defense hung heavily in the air, instantly destroying whatever microscopic shred of doubt my father had tried to plant. My father physically collapsed inward. The broad-shouldered, incredibly confident businessman vanished entirely. His shoulders slumped, his jaw hung slack, and he stared down at his half-eaten dessert with the hollow, defeated eyes of a completely broken man. The mask was gone. The grand illusion he had spent his entire adult life cultivating was reduced to absolute ashes in a matter of 5 minutes. He did not look angry. He just looked pathetic, small, and hopelessly cowardly, caught red-handed. I looked around the table. The wealthy friends they had tried to impress were visibly retreating, shifting their heavy oak chairs backward, physically distancing themselves from the toxic fallout. Their social and professional execution was complete. But I had one final devastating bullet left in the chamber. I closed the heavy binder with a loud, definitive snap. The total amount stolen from me was $96,000. I said, my voice echoing in the dead quiet of the room. But do not worry about paying it back. You will need every cent you have left to manage your own survival now. I looked directly at my grandmother, who was sitting near the end of the table. Her face was completely stoic, her eyes locked onto the two people who had so deeply betrayed her trust. Because as of yesterday morning, I announced, turning my gaze back to my hyperventilating mother and my paralyzed father, my grandmother Eleanor and I went to the bank together. The joint account has been permanently closed. The monthly deposits have been completely redirected into a new secure account solely under my name, and my parents' financial access has been entirely cut off. I watched the final realization hit them like a physical blow to the chest. They were not just publicly humiliated, they were completely financially severed. The pipeline of free money that had funded their extravagant lies was permanently shut off. They had nothing left but the terrifying reality of their own exposed greed. The fallout from that night was absolute and irreversible. Gossip travels faster than light in elite social circles, and within 48 hours, my parents were considered entirely radioactive. The senior partners at my mother's real estate firm quietly forced her into an immediate, uncompensated resignation, citing a sudden misalignment of core corporate values. My father's wealthy investors abruptly pulled their critical backing from his latest business venture, completely refusing to associate their clean capital with a man who could ruthlessly steal from his own starving child. Without that steady hidden stream of $2,000 a month to artificially inflate their checking accounts, and with their professional reputations completely decimated, their entire financial house of cards violently collapsed. Within 6 months, the bank foreclosed on their massive 5-bedroom house. The imported luxury vehicles they loved so much were quietly repossessed by towing companies in the dead of night. They lost every single ounce of the social status they had sacrificed my youth to maintain, entirely shunned by the extended family and the wealthy friends they worshipped. I did not stick around to watch them pack their belongings into cheap cardboard boxes. I was no longer the desperate, exhausted girl searching endlessly for a microscopic drop of parental validation. I had finally found my absolute autonomy. I bought myself a very small, incredibly warm apartment right in the heart of the city. I painted the living room walls a bright, cheerful shade of yellow. I bought a thick, heavy winter duvet, and I made absolutely sure my refrigerator was always fully stocked with fresh, healthy groceries. I never had to sit in the dark to save on electricity, and I never had to calculate the exact cost of a bus ticket ever again. Every single decision I made was entirely my own, completely untainted by their manipulative, fake motivational speeches. Yesterday afternoon, I sat on my comfortable sofa drinking a hot cup of expensive chamomile tea and called my grandmother Eleanor. We did not talk about my parents. We did not mention the missing $96,000 or the ugly, drawn-out bankruptcy hearings. Instead, we talked about my new promotion at work, the beautiful flowers blooming in her garden, and our plans for the upcoming holidays. Her bright, genuine laughter echoed warmly through the phone speaker, and for the very first time in my entire 24 years of life, I laughed right back, feeling completely and utterly weightless. It was the absolute purest form of liberation. My parents now live in a tiny, run-down rental apartment on the extreme outskirts of town, entirely suffocated by the heavy, inescapable weight of their own greed. They spend their miserable days bitterly blaming each other for their spectacular downfall. I do not need to lift another finger against them. I do not need to harbor any lingering hatred or plot any further revenge. They are completely trapped in a suffocating prison of their own making, and I am finally free. Justice is not a violent, deafening scream. Justice is the beautiful, absolute peace that remains after the liars have successfully destroyed themselves. Thank you so very much for listening to my story today on Haley Revenge Stories. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please drop your location in the comments below. If you found my journey compelling and want to help us keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us with just a $1 donation. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the secure PayPal link located in the description and pinned comment below. Your incredible generosity directly pays our hardworking team, allowing them to provide for their families and continue creating these high-quality stories for you to enjoy. Stay strong, and thank you again for your time.